November 1943. Dwight Eisenhower sat at his desk in North Africa facing the worst political crisis of his command. His most aggressive general had just become a public enemy. Congressional leaders were demanding court-martial. And now Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was positioning himself to take supreme command of Allied ground forces for the invasion of Europe. Eisenhower wasn't just reading cables from Washington. He was watching the entire American command structure threaten to collapse before D-Day could even be planned. He sat between the rage of the American public and the calculated ambition of British High Command. This wasn't just about 2 slaps in a field hospital. This was a battle to prevent Allied leadership from destroying itself before the invasion of France could begin. Eisenhower couldn't fire Patton without losing America's best attack general. He couldn't keep Patton without appearing to condone brutality and handing Montgomery the ammunition to seize control. He needed a solution that would enrage everyone, but might keep the alliance from fracturing. He offered Patton a brutal compromise. Keep your rank, lose your command. You'll lead a phantom army of inflatable tanks. No combat, no glory. Just humiliation and deception. Patton would have to choose: accept this public disgrace or face court-martial and complete destruction. Eisenhower waited, knowing that either choice might still lose the war. 3 months earlier, August 10, 1943. Inside a stifling evacuation hospital in Sicily, General George S. Patton had just struck a trembling soldier across the face and drawn his pistol in a rage that would echo across 2 continents. Private Paul Bennett sat on his cot. No visible wounds, just uncontrollable shaking from combat trauma. When Patton demanded what was wrong, Bennett whispered, "It's my nerves, sir. I can't stand the shelling." 10 seconds later, Patton's hand cracked against Bennett's face. "You're a disgrace," he roared, his ivory-handled pistol gleaming. "I should shoot you myself, you coward!" Doctors froze. Nurses gasped. Wounded soldiers watched America's most decorated general threaten to execute a shell-shocked private. This wasn't even the first incident. 1 week earlier, Patton had slapped Private Charles Cool under identical circumstances. 2 soldiers. 2 explosions of rage. 2 incidents that would set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. Within hours, medical staff began whispering. Within days, war correspondents knew the secret. Within weeks, every reporter covering the Mediterranean theater was sitting on the story that could destroy the most famous American general in the war. And then syndicated columnist Drew Pearson went on national radio in November and detonated it. The reaction was volcanic. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. American newspapers erupted with headlines demanding Patton's head. Mothers of soldiers flooded Washington with outraged letters. Women's groups called him a brute and fascist. Congressional leaders publicly questioned whether Patton should face court-martial for abuse. Most dangerously for Eisenhower, the scandal cut deep for Americans who had sons in combat. To them, Patton's violence against traumatized soldiers felt like a betrayal of every family that had sacrificed for the war effort. Montgomery's chief of staff quietly informed Churchill that this proved American generals lacked the emotional discipline for supreme command. Montgomery himself began lobbying Allied leadership. The upcoming invasion of France was too complex, too critical to entrust to commanders who could lose control so catastrophically. The slapping incident had given Montgomery exactly what he needed: evidence that American leadership was unstable. Eisenhower had tried to contain the crisis quietly. He'd ordered Patton to apologize to the soldiers, medical staff, and every division under his command. Patton had obeyed. delivering wooden, resentful apologies that satisfied no one. For 3 months, Eisenhower thought the matter was buried. Now, with the scandal exploding publicly, Eisenhower faced relief orders drafted on his desk. Patton was hours away from being fired. But Eisenhower's own field commanders, Bradley and others, had privately warned him, "Lose Patton, and you lose the offensive capability that might break the Germans in France." The apology Patton had given months earlier prevented nothing. It did nothing to restore public trust or silence the calls for his removal. Now, in November 1943, Eisenhower was about to make the decision that would reshape the entire command structure for D-Day. During the Sicily campaign, Patton had proven himself irreplaceable on the battlefield. His 7th Army had raced Montgomery to Messina, capturing the city first and demonstrating the kind of aggressive, relentless advance that won wars quickly. But Montgomery saw opportunity, where Eisenhower saw military necessity. Patton's public disgrace proved Montgomery's argument. American generals couldn't handle the psychological pressures of modern command. Montgomery had maintained discipline. Montgomery had never lost control. Montgomery should lead the ground forces for the invasion of Europe. Montgomery wanted more than sympathy from Allied leadership. He wanted permanent command authority over American forces. He wanted to ensure that when the invasion came, American armies would operate under his strategic control. Because clearly, they couldn't be trusted to control themselves. For Eisenhower, it felt less like protecting an alliance and more like watching his own command authority being stripped away by a scandal he'd tried desperately to contain. The telegram reached Eisenhower's headquarters on August 17, 1943. Medical officers from 2 separate evacuation hospitals had filed formal complaints. Both described the same man. Both described the same violence. Both incidents involved General George S. Patton. Eisenhower read the reports twice, feeling the weight of what he was holding. This wasn't a tactical problem he could solve with maps and divisions. This was a political bomb that could destroy his most valuable field commander and fracture the entire Allied command structure. His first instinct was containment. Keep it quiet. Manage it internally. Make it go away before it became public. He drafted orders immediately. Patton would apologize, formally and personally, to Private Bennett, Private Kuhl, the medical staff who witnessed the incidents, and every division under his 7th Army command. The apologies would be thorough, humble, and absolute. Patton would acknowledge his error, express genuine remorse, and demonstrate that he understood the severity of what he'd done. That was the plan. Patton's execution was something else entirely. He delivered the apologies like a man reading a ransom note written by his captors. His voice was flat. His words were mechanical. He stood before hospital staff and soldiers with the posture of someone enduring punishment, not offering genuine contrition. Medical officers who heard him weren't moved. They were insulted. Soldiers who witnessed the apologies felt Patton was going through motions to save his career, not because he believed he'd been wrong. One nurse later wrote in her diary, "He apologized with his mouth, but his eyes were still angry." Still, the apologies were delivered. The official record showed Patton had been disciplined. Eisenhower closed the file and hoped that would be enough. For 3 months, it was. The hospitals went quiet. The medical staff stopped filing complaints. War correspondents covering Sicily heard whispers about the incidents but couldn't confirm details and wouldn't publish rumors during active combat operations. By November, the crisis seemed buried. But beneath the surface, fury was building. Nurses who'd watched Patton threaten traumatized soldiers talked quietly among themselves. Doctors who'd seen the incidents shared the story with trusted colleagues. War correspondents compared notes and waited for confirmation they could print. The most dangerous battlefield of World War II was about to shift from North Africa to newsrooms across America. In Washington, syndicated columnist Drew Pearson had just received detailed confirmation from multiple sources. 2 incidents, 2 soldiers, 1 general threatening to execute men suffering from combat trauma. Pearson had built his career on exposing stories that powerful people wanted buried. This was the biggest story of the war. He scheduled a national radio broadcast for November 21, 1943. Eisenhower had no idea what was coming. Patton had no idea his career was about to detonate on live radio. The Allied command structure had no idea that in 72 hours, the slapping incidents would become front-page news across America. And Field Marshal Montgomery had no idea that his greatest rival was about to hand him the opportunity he'd been waiting for. The bomb was armed. The fuse was lit. Drew Pearson checked his notes one final time and prepared to go live. November 21st, 1943. Drew Pearson's voice crackled across millions of American radios during his Sunday evening broadcast. General George Patton, Pearson began, hero of the North African campaign, has been kept from active command because he slapped and cursed a shell-shocked private in a hospital tent. The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. By Monday morning, every major newspaper in America had the story on the front page. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune. Headlines screamed variations of the same outrage. Patton slaps wounded soldier. General threatens shell-shocked private. War hero abuses traumatized GI. Congress erupted. Representative Jed Johnson of Oklahoma demanded immediate court-martial proceedings. Senator Robert Reynolds called Patton's behavior inexcusable brutality that disgraced the uniform. Dozens of congressmen flooded the War Department with demands for answers, investigations, and punishment. But the most devastating responses came from American families. Gold Star mothers, women who'd already lost sons in combat, wrote furious letters to Washington. Their words cut deeper than any congressional speech. One mother from Ohio wrote, "My boy died fighting for this country. How dare General Patton abuse soldiers suffering from the same horrors that killed my son?" Letters poured into the War Department by the thousands. Mothers, wives, fathers of men serving overseas. Veterans organizations, women's groups who called Patton a brute and a fascist, unfit to lead American boys. The scandal didn't just anger officials. It shook American morale. Families who'd sacrificed everything for the war effort now questioned whether their sons were safe from their own commanders. Soldiers writing letters home expressed confusion and betrayal. If generals could abuse traumatized men without consequence, what did that say about the values America was fighting for? Across the Atlantic, Hitler's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels saw opportunity in the chaos. German radio broadcasts trumpeted the scandal as proof of American military dysfunction and moral bankruptcy. Internal Nazi communications celebrated the crisis tearing through Allied command. Wehrmacht officers speculated that the discord might delay or derail the anticipated invasion of France. And in the center of the firestorm stood Eisenhower. Overnight, he transformed from respected supreme commander to the general who'd protected an abuser. Newspapers questioned his judgment. Editorials asked why he'd buried the incidents for 3 months instead of immediately relieving Patton. Congressional leaders demanded to know if Eisenhower valued military effectiveness over basic human decency. His leadership credibility, carefully built through years of coalition management, began cracking along international fault lines. British officials whispered that American command culture was fundamentally flawed. Allied partners questioned whether Eisenhower could be trusted to make difficult moral decisions when they conflicted with military convenience. The man who tried to contain a scandal quietly now faced public judgment from every direction. Washington demanded answers. London watched with skepticism. American families demanded justice. And Montgomery prepared to argue that this chaos proved exactly what he'd been saying all along. Eisenhower sat alone in his headquarters, surrounded by cables demanding Patton's immediate removal. He'd protected Patton, hoping the incidents would stay buried. Now that gamble had exploded spectacularly, and Eisenhower faced the most painful decision of his career: fire the general who might win the war, or keep him and watch his own command authority disintegrate. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery read the American newspaper reports from his headquarters in Britain with barely concealed satisfaction. Patton, his greatest rival, the one American general who matched his own aggressive instincts, was self-destructing in the most public way imaginable. Montgomery hadn't orchestrated the scandal, but he certainly understood how to exploit it. He saw what others missed. This wasn't just about one general's loss of control. This was about who would command Allied ground forces for the invasion of Europe. Montgomery moved quickly. Within days of Pearson's broadcast, he was in Churchill's office making his case. The argument was simple and devastating. American generals lacked the emotional discipline required for the complexity of invading France. "Look at Patton," Montgomery told Churchill and Allied high command. "Their most experienced field commander threatens to execute traumatized soldiers. He cannot control his temper in a hospital tent. How can such men be trusted to control armies during the most critical operation of the war?" The timing was perfect. Montgomery had been lobbying for supreme ground command for months, but his arguments had always hit the same wall. American political power demanded American military leadership. Eisenhower was supreme commander. American forces would soon outnumber British forces in Europe. American equipment and logistics were carrying the Allied war effort. But now, Montgomery had something more powerful than logistics charts. He had evidence. He circulated the argument through British military channels and political networks. American generals were emotionally unstable. They lacked the iron discipline required for modern command. Patton's meltdown wasn't an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of a broader cultural problem in American military leadership. Montgomery positioned himself as the rational alternative. He'd commanded forces from North Africa through Sicily without scandal. He'd never lost control. He'd never threatened his own soldiers. He represented the kind of steady, disciplined leadership the invasion required. British officials who'd been skeptical of Montgomery's ambitions began listening with new interest. Churchill, always protective of British interests in Allied command structures, saw the political opening. If American generals were publicly humiliating themselves, perhaps British leadership deserved greater authority over combined operations. The Whisper campaign gained momentum. Montgomery's chief of staff briefed senior British military leaders. The message was consistent. Patton's disgrace proved Americans needed British command structure to prevent emotional volatility from derailing the invasion. Suddenly, Patton's slap was no longer just a personal scandal between one general and two traumatized soldiers. It had become ammunition in a global power struggle over who would control the liberation of Europe. Montgomery wasn't just defending British military pride. He was maneuvering to take permanent command of American armies. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who would fight under British strategic authority because their own generals had proven they couldn't be trusted. For Montgomery, this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. The Americans had handed him the perfect justification to seize control. Back in North Africa, Eisenhower began receiving cables from Washington warning him about British political maneuvering. Allied headquarters staff reported that Montgomery's lobbying was gaining traction in London. Churchill was making non-committal comments about reviewing command structures for the invasion. Eisenhower realized with growing dread that he wasn't just managing a scandal about Patton's behavior anymore. He was fighting two wars simultaneously. One against Hitler's armies in Europe, and one inside his own alliance, where Montgomery was using Patton's self-destruction to strip American commanders of strategic authority over their own forces. The slapping incident had opened a fracture in Allied command that threatened to split the entire coalition before the invasion of France could even begin. The cables from Washington arrived daily, each one tightening the noose around Eisenhower's decision. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall's message was blunt. The pressure to relieve Patton is enormous and growing. Can you justify keeping him? Secretary of War Henry Stimson was even more direct. Patton has become a political liability that threatens congressional support for the entire war effort. The public demands accountability. Eisenhower understood what they were really saying. Fire Patton, or watch your own credibility collapse along with his. But the cables from Washington told only half the story. Behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny and congressional hearings, Eisenhower's field commanders were telling him something completely different. General Omar Bradley came to Eisenhower's headquarters and spoke with brutal honesty. "We need Patton," Bradley said quietly. "Montgomery fights carefully, methodically. He consolidates positions and minimizes risks. That's fine for some operations. But when we hit the beaches in France, we're going to need someone who can punch through German defenses and keep moving before they can reinforce. That's Patton. Nobody else fights like him." Other American commanders echoed the same warning in private conversations. Patton was irreplaceable on offense. His aggressive instincts, his willingness to take calculated risks, his ability to exploit German weaknesses before they could react. These weren't qualities that could be found in cautious, methodical commanders. But they couldn't say any of this publicly without appearing to condone Patton's abuse of traumatized soldiers. Eisenhower was trapped in an impossible equation. Fire Patton, and he'd lose the one American general whose offensive capabilities might shorten the war and save thousands of lives. Keep Patton, and he'd hand Montgomery all the evidence he needed to argue that American commanders couldn't be trusted with strategic authority. The implications went far beyond one general's career. If Eisenhower fired Patton under public pressure, Montgomery would argue that it proved American leadership was too fragile for the pressures of Supreme Command. British political influence over D-Day planning would increase. American generals would find themselves operating under British strategic control during their own invasion. But if Eisenhower kept Patton despite the public outrage, he risked destroying Allied unity. Congressional support for the war might fracture. American public trust in military leadership could collapse. The coalition that was supposed to liberate Europe might tear itself apart before the first landing craft hit the beaches. The fate of D-Day planning hung in the balance of this single decision. Eisenhower couldn't win. Every option led to catastrophic losses. Fire Patton, lose offensive capability, empower Montgomery, prove American command was subject to public opinion rather than military necessity. Keep Patton in full command. Lose public trust, lose congressional support, lose credibility with Allied partners who were already questioning American judgment. Eisenhower sat alone at his desk and began drafting orders. The first order relieved Patton of command immediately and recommended court-martial proceedings. It satisfied Washington, satisfied public opinion, and destroyed any chance of aggressive American strategy in France. The second order kept Patton in command with a formal reprimand. It satisfied military necessity and guaranteed political catastrophe. The third order was something else entirely. A compromise that would enrage everyone but might, just barely, hold the alliance together. Eisenhower stared at the three different versions of Patton's future, knowing that whichever one he signed would define not just the general's fate, but the entire structure of Allied command for the remainder of the war. One of these orders would end Patton's career forever. The question was whether it would also end Eisenhower's ability to win the war on American terms. Eisenhower signed the Third Order on December 24, 1943. It was a compromise designed to satisfy no one, and it didn't. Patton would keep his rank. He would not face court-martial, but he would be removed from combat command indefinitely. He would not lead troops in the invasion of Europe. Instead, he would command the 1st United States Army Group, a force that existed only on paper and in German imagination. The assignment was brilliant strategy and brutal humiliation wrapped together. Patton, America's most aggressive battlefield commander, would lead an army of inflatable tanks, plywood artillery, fake radio transmissions, and actors playing the role of soldiers. His headquarters would generate false intelligence for German spies to discover. His divisions would conduct training exercises that aerial reconnaissance could photograph. His entire command existed for one purpose: to make Hitler believe the main Allied invasion would hit Calais, not Normandy. He became the most powerful decoy in military history. For a general who lived for combat, it was worse than firing squad. Patton had spent his entire career preparing for decisive battle. Now he gave speeches to non-existent divisions. He reviewed inflatable equipment. He supervised radio operators broadcasting fake communications designed to fool German intelligence. Every day in England was a reminder of what he'd lost in 10 seconds of rage. Meanwhile, Montgomery shaped the invasion strategy Patton should have been planning. As Eisenhower's ground forces commander for the initial invasion phase, Montgomery controlled D-Day operational planning. He designed the beach assault. He positioned forces. He established the methodical, cautious approach that defined British military doctrine. American generals chafed under Montgomery's authority. But the slapping scandal had given the British field marshal exactly what he wanted: strategic control over combined Allied ground operations during the war's most critical phase. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. American soldiers fought and trained on Omaha Beach. British and Canadian forces pushed inland from Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. And George Patton sat in England, commanding phantom armies while the real war happened without him. He watched from the sidelines as the invasion he'd trained for his entire career unfolded under Montgomery's command. He read intelligence reports about American forces struggling in the Norman hedgerows. Terrain perfectly suited to German defensive tactics and brutally difficult for attackers trying to break through. Patton sank into rage that he could barely contain. The humiliation was constant. Reporters asked why he wasn't in France. Soldiers wondered why their most famous general was sitting idle. His own staff watched him deteriorate. Anger giving way to shame. Shame giving way to desperate hope that somehow, someday, he'd get another chance. But he waited. He followed orders. He maintained the deception. He controlled the temper that had destroyed his career, knowing that one more incident would finish him permanently. Across the English Channel, German intelligence officers studied reconnaissance photographs and intercepted radio traffic from Patton's headquarters. They reached the conclusion Allied planners desperately needed them to reach. Patton commanded the real invasion force. Normandy was a diversion. The main assault would come at Calais, where Germany's greatest general would lead the decisive battle. Hitler's high command held massive panzer divisions in reserve at Calais, waiting for Patton's phantom army to attack. Germany was watching the greatest decoy operation in history and making a fatal miscalculation that would save thousands of Allied lives. But it also meant that when Montgomery's methodical approach bogged down in the hedgerows, when American momentum stalled, when Allied forces needed the kind of breakthrough that only aggressive, audacious command could deliver, Patton was nowhere near the battlefield. The general who might have turned stalemate into victory sat in England, waiting for a redemption that might never come. German intelligence had studied George Patton for years. They knew his reputation. They knew his tactics. They knew he was America's most dangerous field commander. So when their reconnaissance aircraft photographed massive tank formations at Patton's headquarters in southeast England, when their agents reported intense activity across from Calais, when intercepted radio traffic revealed Patton commanding a force of over 150,000 men, they reached the obvious conclusion. Normandy was a diversion. Patton would lead the real invasion at Calais. Hitler's high command refused to release panzer divisions from Calais even after Allied forces stormed the Normandy beaches on June 6th. The Führer himself believed Montgomery's operation was a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the actual invasion site. They were waiting for Patton. The irony was devastating and perfect. Patton's disgrace, his removal from combat command, his exile to a phantom army, made the deception credible. German intelligence couldn't imagine the Allies launching their main invasion without their best general leading it. Patton's absence from Normandy proved Normandy wasn't the main event. Massive German armored divisions sat idle at Calais for weeks after D-Day, convinced the real battle was still coming. The deception saved thousands of Allied lives. Patton, humiliated, exiled, commanding inflatable tanks, had contributed more to D-Day's success by not being there than he could have by leading actual divisions on the beaches. But the strategic victory came with a mounting cost. Montgomery commanded Allied ground forces with the methodical caution that defined British military doctrine. He consolidated positions. He minimized risks. He advanced carefully, ensuring supply lines were secure before pushing forward. It was textbook warfare, and it was grinding Allied momentum to a halt. American forces bogged down in the Norman hedgerows, fighting brutal yard-by-yard battles through terrain that favored German defenders. The breakthrough that D-Day was supposed to create wasn't happening. Weeks passed, then months. Allied forces were ashore, but they weren't breaking out. American commanders grew increasingly frustrated, watching Montgomery's slow, cautious advance. Then came Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Montgomery's ambitious plan to end the war by Christmas through a rapid thrust into the Netherlands. It failed catastrophically. British airborne forces dropped deep behind German lines at Arnhem, expecting ground forces to reach them within days. Montgomery's armored columns never arrived in time. Thousands of elite paratroopers were killed, wounded, or captured. The operation that was supposed to punch through to Germany instead became one of the war's worst Allied defeats. American frustration boiled over into barely concealed anger. The Allies needed what Montgomery couldn't provide. They needed shock. They needed speed. They needed the kind of violent, relentless offensive action that kept German forces reacting instead of defending. They needed Patton. Bradley told Eisenhower bluntly, "We've been in France for 3 months, and we're still fighting in hedgerows. Montgomery's broken down at Arnhem. We need someone who can break this open." Other American commanders echoed the same message privately. The war was stalling. German defenders were adapting to Montgomery's predictable, methodical approach. If Allied forces were going to reach Germany before winter, they needed a general who fought with audacity instead of caution. Eisenhower faced the decision he'd been dreading since the slapping scandal exploded. Patton's exile had been politically necessary. It had satisfied public outrage. It had prevented the command crisis from destroying Allied unity. It had even, accidentally, contributed to D-Day's success through the deception operation. But now, the war needed what only Patton could deliver. In late July 1944, Eisenhower made the most daring leadership gamble of the entire war. He activated Patton's Third Army and unleashed him into France. One more incident, one more loss of control, one more public scandal, and both their careers would be finished. The American public hadn't forgotten the slapping. Congress hadn't forgiven Patton. The humiliation of exile hadn't erased what he'd done. But Eisenhower was betting everything that the general who'd been destroyed by 10 seconds of rage could save the war that Montgomery's caution was slowly losing. August 1st, 1944. Patton's Third Army became operational in France. Within 72 hours, Eisenhower knew he'd made the right gamble. Patton exploded across the French countryside with a fury that vindicated every argument for keeping him. While Montgomery consolidated positions and planned methodical advances, Patton's armor raced forward at speeds that shocked both Allied and German commands. His Third Army advanced 40 miles per day, an operational tempo considered impossible by conventional military doctrine. German defenders prepared defensive lines only to discover Patton had already bypassed them and was attacking their rear positions. Supply officers struggled to keep pace with armor columns that moved faster than fuel trucks could follow. Cities fell in rapid succession: Avranches, Le Mans, Chartres, Orléans. Names that appeared on maps one day were liberated the next. French civilians who'd endured 4 years of Nazi occupation watched American tanks roar through their streets before German commanders even realized those towns were threatened. Patton didn't fight battles. He created chaos that German forces couldn't recover from. In 6 weeks, the Third Army advanced farther than any army in military history. 600 miles of French territory liberated. Entire German divisions trapped and destroyed. The rigid defensive structure Hitler's generals tried to establish in France collapsed under relentless pressure that never let them consolidate or counterattack. Montgomery's slow precision doctrine suddenly looked outdated by comparison. While British forces carefully consolidated their positions in the north, Patton was racing toward Paris, trapping German divisions in the Falaise pocket, and functionally ending German hopes of stabilizing the Western Front before winter. American newspapers that had demanded Patton's head 1 year earlier now celebrated his brilliance. Headlines trumpeted the Third Army's unprecedented advance. Soldiers who'd questioned whether their disgraced general deserved another chance watched him prove exactly why Eisenhower had protected him. Patton became living proof that Eisenhower's risky decision had been right. The general who'd been exiled for 10 seconds of rage was now delivering exactly what the war needed: aggressive, audacious offensive action that gave German forces no time to breathe, no opportunity to defend, no chance to stop the Allied advance. Bradley watched Patton's performance and told Eisenhower, "This is what we would have lost if we'd fired him." Montgomery watched the same performance with barely concealed irritation, seeing his own methodical approach criticized in the shadow of Patton's spectacular success. But the shadow of the slapping incident never fully disappeared. Reporters covering Patton's advance still mentioned the scandal in their articles. Congressional leaders who'd twice demanded his court-martial remained skeptical. Families who'd been outraged by his abuse of traumatized soldiers hadn't forgotten, even if they appreciated his military success. Patton's redemption was operational, not moral. He'd proven himself invaluable on the battlefield, but he hadn't erased what he'd done in that hospital tent. The question lingering beneath every headline celebrating the Third Army's advance was simple. Had Eisenhower been right to protect a flawed genius? Or had he simply been lucky that Patton's demons stayed contained long enough to win battles? By December 1944, that question seemed academic. The Third Army was approaching the German border. Allied forces were positioned to invade Germany itself. The war seemed nearly won. Then, on December 16th, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, slammed into American positions with overwhelming force. Entire divisions were surrounded. Communication lines collapsed. American forces fell back in confusion as German panzers punched deep into Allied territory. The ultimate test had arrived, and Eisenhower needed the one general who could counterattack with the speed and violence necessary to stop the German breakthrough before it destroyed the entire Allied front. He needed Patton. December 16, 1944. German forces smashed through the Ardennes with a ferocity that caught Allied command completely off guard. 24 German divisions, over 200,000 men supported by hundreds of tanks, punched a 50-mile-wide hole in American lines. Entire regiments were surrounded. Communication collapsed. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft. For the first time since D-Day, the Western Front was in danger of catastrophic collapse. Eisenhower called an emergency conference on December 19th. His commanders gathered in Verdun to assess the crisis and plan a response. Montgomery recommended defensive consolidation. Pull back, establish secure lines, wait for German momentum to exhaust itself, then counterattack methodically when conditions improved. It was textbook military doctrine, cautious, rational, designed to minimize risks. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. "When can you attack?" Eisenhower asked. Patton's answer was immediate. "December 22nd, 72 hours, 3 divisions." The room went silent. Patton's Third Army was positioned 100 miles south of the German breakthrough. Pivoting an entire army, repositioning divisions, redirecting supply lines, coordinating movement through winter conditions on congested roads, within 72 hours was considered militarily impossible. Patton promised it anyway. He delivered in 48 hours. On December 22nd, 3 full divisions from Patton's Third Army slammed into the southern flank of the German offensive with overwhelming violence. The attack came so fast the German commanders couldn't react. Patton's armor punched through defensive positions, relieved the surrounded 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, and began systematically destroying the German spearhead that had threatened to split the Allied armies. Within days, the German offensive was collapsing. Within weeks, Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed completely. Patton had saved Bastogne. He'd saved trapped American divisions. He'd saved Allied morale when the entire front hung in the balance, and he'd proven his worth beyond any scandal. The slap in that Sicilian hospital had nearly destroyed Patton's career. The public outrage had nearly handed Montgomery permanent control of Allied ground forces. The scandal had threatened to fracture the entire command structure before D-Day could be planned. Eisenhower had risked everything to protect a general who'd committed an unforgivable act, betting his own career on the belief that flawed genius was more valuable than perfect mediocrity. The gamble had almost failed. For 11 months, Patton sat in exile while Montgomery shaped Allied strategy. The political cost was enormous. The moral questions never disappeared. But when the war reached its critical moments, when Allied forces needed breakthrough speed in France, When German offensives threatened catastrophic collapse in the Ardennes, Patton delivered exactly what Eisenhower had gambled on. His battlefield brilliance didn't excuse the slapping incidents. It didn't erase the trauma he'd inflicted on 2 soldiers suffering from combat shock. It didn't resolve the moral complexity of protecting someone who'd abused traumatized men. But it validated Eisenhower's impossible choice. The war had nearly been lost to politics, to public outrage, congressional pressure, allied power struggles, and the pressure to sacrifice military effectiveness for moral clarity. It was saved by courage, flawed humanity, and daring leadership willing to bet everything on an imperfect man who delivered when the world needed him most. History remembers Patton's race across France. It remembers the relief of Bastogne. It remembers the Third Army's unprecedented operational tempo that helped end the war in Europe. It barely remembers the slapping incidents that almost prevented any of that from happening. But the real story isn't about forgetting Patton's failures. It's about Eisenhower's willingness to gamble on redemption when every rational calculation said to cut losses and move on. Sometimes victories survive only because leaders refuse the easy moral choice and make the hard strategic bet. On flawed men, on second chances, on the belief that imperfect genius can still save the world. The slap nearly lost the war. The gamble on redemption won it. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm this piece of history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to rescuing these forgotten stories from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state and tell us if someone in your family served.